White Fang by Jack London, Part 4, Chapter 3. Chapter 3. The Reign of Hate. Under the tutelage of the mad god, White Fang became a fiend. He was kept chained in a pen at the rear of the fort, and here Beauty Smith teased and irritated and drove him wild with petty torments. The man early discovered White Fang's susceptibility to laughter, and made it a point, after painfully tricking him, to laugh at him. This laughter was uproarious and scornful, and at the same time the god pointed his finger derisively at White Fang. At such times reason fled from White Fang, and in his transports of rage he was even more mad than Beauty Smith. Formerly, White Fang had been merely the enemy of his kind, withal a ferocious enemy. He now became the enemy of all things, and more ferocious than ever. To such an extent was he tormented that he hated blindly and without the faintest spark of reason. He hated the chain that bound him, the men who peered in at him through the slats of the pen, the dogs that accompanied the men and that snarled malignantly at him in his helplessness. He hated the very wood of the pen that confined him. And first, last, and most of all, he hated Beauty Smith. But Beauty Smith had a purpose in all that he did to White Fang. One day a number of men gathered about the pen. Beauty Smith entered, club in hand, and took the chain off from White Fang's neck. When his master had gone out, White Fang turned loose and tore around the pen, trying to get at the men outside. He was magnificently terrible, fully 5 feet in length, and standing 2 1/2 feet at the shoulder. He far outweighed a wolf of corresponding size. From his mother he had inherited the heavier proportions of the dog, so that he weighed without any fat and without an ounce of superfluous flesh over 90 pounds. It was all muscle, bone, and sinew-fighting flesh in the finest condition. The door of the pen was being opened again. White Fang paused. Something unusual was happening. He waited. The door was opening wider. Then a huge dog was thrust inside, and the door was slammed shut behind him. White Fang had never seen such a dog. It was a mastiff, but the size and fierce aspect of the intruder did not deter him. Here was something, not wood nor iron, upon which to wreak his hate. He leaped in, with a flash of fangs that ripped down the side of the mastiff's neck. The mastiff shook his head, growled hoarsely, and plunged at White Fang. But White Fang was here, there, and everywhere, always evading and eluding, always leaping in and slashing with his fangs, and leaping out again in time to escape punishment. The men outside shouted and applauded, while Beauty Smith, in an ecstasy of delight, gloated over the ripping and mangling performed by White Fang. There was no hope for the mastiff from the first. He was too ponderous and slow. In the end, while Beauty Smith beat White Fang back with a club, the mastiff was dragged out by its owner. Then there was a payment of bets, and money clinked in Beauty Smith's hand. White Fang came to look forward eagerly to the gathering of the men around his pen. It meant a fight, and this was the only way that was now vouchsafed him of expressing the life that was in him. Tormented, inclined to hate, he was kept a prisoner so that there was no way of satisfying that hate except at the times his master saw fit to put another dog against him. Beauty Smith had estimated his power well, for he was invariably the victor. One day 3 dogs were turned upon him in succession. Another day a full-grown wolf, fresh caught from the wild, was shoved in through the door of the pen. And on still another day 2 dogs were set against him at the same time. This was his severest fight, and though in the end he killed them both, he was himself half killed in doing it. In the fall of the year, when the first snows were falling and mush ice was running in the river, Beauty Smith took passage for himself and White Fang on a steamboat bound up the Yukon to Dawson. White Fang had now achieved a reputation in the land. As the fighting wolf was he known far and wide, and the cage in which he was kept on the steamboat's deck was usually surrounded by curious men. He raged and snarled at them, or lay quietly and studied them with cold hatred. Why should he not hate them? He never asked himself the question. He only knew hate and lost himself in the passion of it. Life had become a hell to him. He had not been made for the close confinement wild beasts endure at the hands of men. And yet it was in precisely this way that he was treated. Men stared at him, poked sticks between the bars to make him snarl, and then laughed at him. They were his environment, these men, and they were molding the clay of him into a more ferocious thing than had been intended by nature. Nevertheless, nature had given him plasticity. Where many another animal would have died or had its spirit broken, he adjusted himself and lived, at no expense of the spirits. Possibly Beauty Smith, archfiend and tormentor, was capable of breaking White Fang's spirit, but as yet there were no signs of his succeeding. If Beauty Smith had in him a devil, White Fang had another, and the two of them raged against each other unceasingly. In the days before, White Fang had had the wisdom to cower down and submit to a man with a club in his hand, but this wisdom now left him. The mere sight of Beauty Smith was sufficient to send him into transports of fury, and when they came to close quarters, and he had been beaten back by the club, he went on growling and snarling and showing his fangs. The last growl could never be extracted from him. No matter how terribly he was beaten, he had always another growl. And when Beauty Smith gave up and withdrew, the defiant growl followed after him, or White Fang sprang at the bars of the cage, bellowing his hatred. When the steamboat arrived at Dawson, White Fang went ashore, but he still lived the public life in a cage surrounded by curious men. He was exhibited as the Fighting Wolf, and men paid 50 cents in gold dust to see him. He was given no rest. Did he lie down to sleep, he was stirred up by a sharp stick, so that the audience might get its money's worth. In order to make the exhibition interesting, he was kept in a rage most of the time. But worse than all this was the atmosphere in which he lived. He was regarded as the most fearful of wild beasts, and this was borne into him through the bars of the cage. Every word, every cautious action on the part of the men, impressed upon him his own terrible ferocity. It was so much added fuel to the flame of his fierceness. There could be but one result, and that was his ferocity fed upon itself and increased. It was another instance of the plasticity of his clay, of his capacity for being molded by the pressure of environment. In addition to being exhibited, he was a professional fighting animal. At irregular intervals, whenever a fight could be arranged, he was taken out of his cage and led off into the woods a few miles from town. Usually this occurred at night, so as to avoid interference from the mounted police of the territory. After a few hours of waiting, when daylight had come, the audience and the dog with which he was to fight arrived. In this manner it came about that he fought all sizes and breeds of dogs. It was a savage land, the men were savage, and the fights were usually to the death. Since White Fang continued to fight, it is obvious that it was the other dogs that died. He never knew defeat. His early training, when he fought with Lip-Lip and the whole puppy pack, stood him in good stead. There was the tenacity with which he clung to the earth. No dog could make him lose his footing. This was the favorite trick of the wolf breeds, to rush in upon him, either directly or with an unexpected swerve, in the hope of striking his shoulder and overthrowing him. Mackenzie hounds, Eskimo and Labrador dogs, Huskies and Malamutes all tried it on him, and all failed. He was never known to lose his footing. Men told this to one another and looked each time to see it happen, but White Fang always disappointed them. Then there was his lightning quickness. It gave him a tremendous advantage over his antagonists. No matter what their fighting experience, they had never encountered a dog that moved so swiftly as he. Also to be reckoned with was the immediateness of his attack. The average dog was accustomed to the preliminaries of snarling and bristling and growling, and the average dog was knocked off his feet and finished before he had begun to fight or recovered from his surprise. So often did this happen that it became the custom to hold White Fang until the other dog went through its preliminaries, was good and ready, and even made the first attack. But greatest of all the advantages in White Fang's favor was his experience. He knew more about fighting than did any of the dogs that faced him. He had fought more fights, knew how to meet more tricks and methods, and had more tricks himself, while his own method was scarcely to be improved upon. As the time went by, he had fewer and fewer fights. Men despaired of matching him with an equal, and Beauty Smith was compelled to pit wolves against him. These were trapped by the Indians for the purpose, and a fight between White Fang and a wolf was always sure to draw a crowd. Once, a full-grown female lynx was secured, and this time White Fang fought for his life. Her quickness matched his, her ferocity equaled his. While he fought with his fangs alone, she fought with her sharp-clawed feet as well. But after the lynx, all fighting ceased for White Fang. There were no more animals with which to fight. At least, there was none considered worthy of fighting him. So he remained on exhibition until spring, when one Tim Keenan, a faro dealer, arrived in the land. With him came the first bulldog that had ever entered the Klondike. That this dog and White Fang should come together was inevitable, and for a week the anticipated fight was the mainspring of conversation in certain quarters of the town. End of Chapter 3. White Fang, by Jack London. Part 4, Chapter 4. Chapter 4. The Clinging Death. Beauty Smith slipped the chain from his neck and stepped back. For once, White Fang did not make an immediate attack. He stood still, ears pricked forward, alert and curious, surveying the strange animal that faced him. He had never seen such a dog before. Tim Keenan shoved the bulldog forward with a muttered, "Go to it." The animal waddled towards the center of the circle, short and squat and ungainly. He came to a stop and blinked across at White Fang. There were cries from the crowd of, "Go to him, Cherokee! Sick him, Cherokee! Eat him up!" But Cherokee did not seem anxious to fight. He turned his head and blinked at the men who shouted, at the same time wagging his stump of a tail good-naturedly. He was not afraid, but merely lazy. Besides, it did not seem to him that it was intended he should fight the dog he saw before him. He was not used to fighting with that kind of dog, and he was waiting for them to bring on the real dog. Tim Keenan stepped in and bent over Cherokee, fondling him on both sides of the shoulders with hands that rubbed against the grain of the hair and that made slight, pushing forward movements. These were so many suggestions. Also, their effect was irritating, for Cherokee began to growl very softly deep down in his throat. There was a correspondence in rhythm between the growls and the movements on the man's hands. The growl rose in the throat with the culmination of each forward-pushing movement and ebbed down to start up afresh with the beginning of the next movement. The end of each movement was the accent of the rhythm, the movement ending abruptly and the growling rising with a jerk. This was not without its effect on White Fang. The hair began to rise on his neck and across the shoulders. Tim Keenan gave a final shove forward and stepped back again. As the impetus that carried Cherokee forward died down, he continued to go forward of his own volition in a swift, bow-legged run. Then White Fang struck. A cry of startled admiration went up. He had covered the distance and gone in more like a cat than a dog, and with the same cat-like swiftness he had slashed with his fangs and leaped clear. The bulldog was bleeding back of one ear, from a rip in his thick neck. He gave no sign, did not even snarl, but turned and followed after White Fang. The display on both sides, the quickness of one and the steadiness of the other, had excited the partisan spirit in the crowd, and the men were making new bets and increasing original bets. Again, and yet again, White Fang sprang in, slashed, and got away untouched, and still his strange foe followed after him without too great haste, not slowly, but deliberately and determinedly, in a businesslike sort of way. There was purpose in his method, something for him to do that he was intent upon doing, and from which nothing could distract him. His whole demeanor, every action, was swamped with this purpose. It puzzled White Fang. Never had he seen such a dog. It had no hair protection. It was soft and bled easily. There was no thick mat of fur to baffle White Fang's teeth, as they were so often baffled by dogs of his own breed. Each time that his teeth struck, they sank easily into the yielding flesh, while the animal did not seem to be able to defend itself. Another disconcerting thing was that it made no outcry, such as he had been accustomed to with other dogs that he had fought. Beyond a growl or a grunt, the dog took its punishment silently, and never did it flag in its pursuit of him. Not that Cherokee was slow. He could turn and whirl swiftly enough, but White Fang was never there. Cherokee was puzzled, too. He had never fought before with a dog with which he could not close. The desire to close had always been mutual. But here was a dog that kept at a distance, dancing and dodging here and there and all about. And when it did get its teeth into him, it did not hold on, but let go instantly and darted away again. But White Fang could not get at the soft underside of the coat. The bulldog stood too short, while its massive jaws were an added protection. White Fang darted in and out unscathed, while Cherokee's wounds increased. Both sides of his neck and head were ripped and slashed. He bled freely, but showed no signs of being disconcerted. He continued his plodding pursuit, though once, for the moment baffled, he came to a full stop and blinked at the men who looked on, at the same time wagging his stump of a tail as an expression of his willingness to fight. In that moment White Fang was in upon him and out, in passing ripping his trimmed remnant of an ear. With the slight manifestation of anger, Cherokee took up the pursuit again, running on the inside of the circle White Fang was making, and striving to fasten his deadly grip on White Fang's throat. The bulldog missed by a hair's breadth, and cries of praise went up as White Fang doubled suddenly out of danger in the opposite direction. The time went by. White Fang still danced on, dodging and doubling, leaping in and out and never inflicting damage, and still the bulldog with grim certitude toiled after him. Sooner or later he would accomplish its purpose, get the grip that would win the battle. In the meantime he accepted all the punishment the other could deal him. His tufts of ears had become tassels, his neck and shoulders were slashed in a score of places, and his very lips were cutting and bleeding, all from these lightning snaps that were beyond his foreseeing and guarding. Time and time again White Fang had attempted to knock Cherokee off his feet, but the difference in their height was too great. Cherokee was too squat, too close to the ground. White Fang tried the trick once too often. The chance came in one of his quick doublings and counter-circlings. He caught Cherokee with head turned away as he whirled more slowly. His shoulder was exposed. White Fang drove in upon it. But his own shoulder was high above, while he struck with such force that his momentum carried him on across over the other's body. For the first time in his fighting history, men saw White Fang lose his footing. His body turned a half-somersault in the air, and he would have landed on his back had he not twisted cat-like still in the air in the effort to bring his feet to the earth. As it was, he struck heavily on his side. The next instant he was on his feet, but in that instant Cherokee's teeth closed on his throat. It was not a good grip, being too low down toward the chest, but Cherokee held on. White Fang sprang to his feet and tore wildly around, trying to shake off the bulldog's body. It made him frantic, this clinging, dragging weight. It bound his movements, restricted his freedom. It was like the trap, and all his instinct resented and revolted against it. It was a mad revolt. For several minutes he was to all intents insane. The basic life that was in him took charge of him. The will to exist of his body surged over him. He was dominated by this mere flesh love of life. All intelligence was gone. It was as though he had no brain. His reason was unseated by the blind yearning of the flesh to exist and move. At all hazards to move, to continue to move, for movement was the expression of its existence. Round and round he went, whirling and turning and reversing, trying to shake off the 50-pound weight that dragged at his throat. The bulldog did little but keep his grip. Sometimes, and rarely, he managed to get his feet to the earth, for a moment brace himself against White Fang, but the next moment his footing would be lost, and he would be dragging around in the whirl of one of White Fang's mad gyrations. Cherokee identified himself with this instinct. He knew that he was doing the right thing by holding on, and there came to him certain blissful thrills of satisfaction. At such moments he even closed his eyes and allowed his body to be hurled hither and thither, willy-nilly, careless of any hurt that might thereby come to it. That did not count. The grip was the thing, and the grip he kept. White Fang ceased only when he had tired himself out. He could do nothing, and he could not understand. Never, in all his fighting, had this thing happened. The dogs he had fought with did not fight this way. With them, it was snap and slash and get away. Snap and slash and get away. He lay partly on his side, panting for breath. Cherokee, still holding his grip, urged against him, trying to get him over entirely on his side. White Fang resisted, and he could feel the jaws shifting their grip, slightly relaxing and coming together again in a chewing movement. Each shift brought the grip closer to his throat. The bulldog's method was to hold what he had, and when opportunity favored, to work in for more. Opportunity favored when White Fang remained quiet. When White Fang struggled, Cherokee was content merely to hold on. The bulging back of Cherokee's neck was the only portion of his body that White Fang's teeth could reach. He got a hold towards the base, where the neck comes out from the shoulders, but he did not know the chewing method of fighting, nor were his jaws adapted to it. He spasmodically ripped and tore with his fangs for a space. Then a change in their position diverted him. The bulldog had managed to roll him over onto his back, and still hanging onto his throat was on top of him. Like a cat, White Fang bowed his hindquarters in, and with the feet digging into his enemy's abdomen above him, he began to claw with long, tearing strokes. Cherokee might as well have been disemboweled had he not quickly pivoted on his grip and got his body off of White Fang's and at right angles to it. There was no escaping that grip. It was like fate itself, and as inexorable. Slowly it shifted up along the jugular. All that saved White Fang from death was the loose skin of his neck and the thick fur that covered it. This served to form a large roll in Cherokee's mouth, the fur of which well-nigh defied his teeth. But bit by bit, whenever the chance offered, he was getting more of the loose skin and fur in his mouth. The result was that he was slowly throttling White Fang. The latter's breath was drawn in with greater and greater difficulty as the moments went by. It began to look as though the battle were over. The backers of Cherokee waxed jubilant and offered ridiculous odds. White Fang's backers were correspondingly depressed and refused bets of 10-1 and 20-1, though one man was rash enough to offer a wager of 50-1. This man was Beauty Smith. He took a step into the ring and pointed his finger at White Fang. Then he began to laugh derisively and scornfully. This produced the desired effect. White Fang went wild with rage. He called up his reserves of strength and gained his feet. As he struggled around the ring, the 50 pounds of his foe ever dragging on his throat, his anger passed into panic. The basic life of him dominated him again as his intelligence fled before the will of his flesh to live. Round and back again, stumbling and falling and rising, even uprearing at times on his hind legs and lifting his foe clear of the earth, he struggled vainly to shake off the clinging death. At last he fell, toppling backward exhausted, and the bulldog promptly shifted his grip, getting in closer, mangling more and more of the fur-folded flesh, throttling White Fang more severely than ever. Shouts of applause went up for the victor, and there were many cries of, "Cherokee! Cherokee!" To this, Cherokee responded by vigorous wagging of the stump of his tail. But the clamor of approval did not distract him. There was no sympathetic relation between his tail and his massive jaws. The one might wag, but the other held their terrible grip on White Fang's throat. It was at this time that a diversion came to the spectators. There was a jingle of bells. Dog mushers' cries were heard. Everybody save Beauty Smith looked apprehensively, the fear of the police strong upon them. But they saw, up the trail and not down, 2 men running with sled and dogs. They were evidently coming down the creek from some prospecting trip. At sight of the crowd, they stopped their dogs and came over and joined it, curious to see the cause of the excitement. The dog musher wore a mustache, but the other, a taller and younger man, was smooth-shaven, his skin rosy from the pounding of his blood and the running in the frosty air. White Fang had practically ceased struggling. Now and again he resisted spasmodically, and to no purpose. He could get little air, and that little grew less and less under the merciless grip that ever tightened. In spite of his armor of fur, the great vein of his throat would have long since been torn open, had not the first grip of the bulldog been so low down as to be practically on the chest. It had taken Cherokee a long time to shift that grip upward, and this had also tended further to clog his jaws with fur and skin fold. In the meantime, the abysmal brute in Beauty Smith had been rising into his brain and mastering the small bit of sanity that he possessed at best. When he saw White Fang's eyes beginning to glaze, he knew beyond a doubt that the fight was lost. Then he broke loose. He sprang upon White Fang and began savagely to kick him. There were hisses from the crowd and cries of protest, but that was all. While this went on and Beauty Smith continued to kick White Fang, there was a commotion in the crowd. The tall young newcomer was forcing his way through, shouldering men right and left without ceremony or gentleness. When he broke into the ring, Beauty Smith was just in the act of delivering another kick. All his weight was on one foot, and he was in a state of unstable equilibrium. At that moment the newcomer's fist landed a smashing blow full in the face. Beauty Smith's remaining leg left on the ground, and his whole body seemed to lift into the air as he turned over backward and struck the snow. The newcomer turned upon the crowd. "You cowards! You beasts!" He was in a rage himself, a sane rage. His grey eyes seemed metallic and steel-like as they flashed upon the crowd. Beauty Smith regained his feet and came toward him, sniffling and cowardly. The newcomer did not understand. He did not know how abject a coward the other was, and thought he was coming back intent on fighting. So with a "you beast," he smashed Beauty Smith over backward with a second blow in the face. Beauty Smith decided that the snow was the safest place for him, and lay where he had fallen, making no effort to get up. "Come on, Matt, lend a hand." The newcomer called the dog musher, who had followed him into the ring. Both men bent over the dogs. Matt took hold of White Fang, ready to pull when Cherokee's jaws could be loosened. This the younger man endeavored to accomplish by clutching the bulldog's jaws in his hands and trying to spread them. It was a vain undertaking. As he pulled and tugged and wrenched, he kept exclaiming with every expulsion of breath, "Beasts!" The crowd began to grow unruly, and some of the men were protesting against the spoiling of the sport, but they were silenced when the newcomer lifted his head from his work for a moment and glared at them. "You damn beasts!" he finally exploded, and went back to his task. "It's no use, Mr. Scott. You can't break 'em apart that way," Matt said at last. The hare paused and surveyed the locked dogs. "Ain't bleeding much," Matt announced. "Ain't got all the way in yet." "But he's liable at any moment," Scott answered. "There, did you see that? He shifted his grip a bit." The other reached into the holster at his hip, drew his revolver, and tried to thrust its muzzle between the bulldog's jaws. He shoved and shoved hard, till the grating of the steel against the locked teeth could be distinctly heard. Both men were on their knees, bending over the dogs. Tim Keenan strode into the ring. He paused beside Scott and touched him on the shoulder, saying ominously, "Don't break them teeth, stranger." "Then I'll break his neck," Scott retorted, continuing his shoving and wedging with the revolver muzzle. "I said, don't break them teeth," the faro dealer repeated more ominously than before. But if it was a bluff he intended, it did not work. Scott never desisted from his efforts, though he looked up coolly and asked, "Your dog?" The faro dealer grunted. "Then get in here and break his grip." "Well, stranger," the other drawled irritatingly, "I don't mind telling you that's something I ain't worked out for myself. I don't know how to turn the trick." "Then get out of the way," was the reply, "and don't bother me. I'm busy." Tim Keenan continued standing over him, but Scott took no further notice of his presence. He had managed to get the muzzle in between the jaws on one side and was trying to get it out between the jaws on the other side. This accomplished, he pried gently and carefully, loosening the jaws a bit at a time, while Matt, a bit at a time, extricated White Fang's mangled neck. "Stand by to receive your dog," was Scott's peremptory order to Cherokee's owner. The faro dealer stooped down obediently and got a firm hold on Cherokee. "Now!" Scott warned, giving a final pry. The dogs were drawn apart, the bulldog struggling vigorously. "Take him away," Scott commanded, and Tim Keenan dragged Cherokee back into the crowd. White Fang made several ineffectual efforts to get up. Once he gained his feet, but his legs were too weak to sustain him, and slowly wilted and sank back into the snow. His eyes were half closed, and the surface of them was glassy. His jaws were apart, and through them the tongue protruded, draggled and limp. To all appearances he looked like a dog that had been strangled to death. Matt examined him. "Just about all in," he announced. "But he's breathing all right." Beauty Smith had regained his feet and come over to look at White Fang. "Matt, how much is a good sled dog worth?" Scott asked. The dog musher, still on his knees and stooped over White Fang, calculated for a moment. $300, he answered. "And how much for one that's all chewed up like this one?" Scott asked, nudging White Fang with his foot. "Half of that," was the dog musher's judgment. Scott turned upon Beauty Smith. "Did you hear, Mr. Beast? I'm going to take your dog from you, and I'm going to give you $150 for him." He opened his pocketbook and counted the bills. Beauty Smith put his hands behind his back, refusing to touch the proffered money. "I ain't a-sellin'," he said. "Oh, yes, you are," the other assured him, "because I'm buying. Here's your money. The dog's mine." Beauty Smith, his hands still behind him, began to back away. Scott sprang toward him, drawing his fist back to strike. Beauty Smith cowered down in anticipation of the blow. "I've got my rights," he whimpered. "You've forfeited your rights to own that dog," was the rejoinder. "Are you going to take the money, or do I have to hit you again?" "All right," Beauty Smith spoke up with the alacrity of fear. "But I take the money under protest," he added. "A dog's a mint. I ain't a-going to be robbed. A man's got his rights." "Correct," Scott answered, passing the money over to him. "A man's got his rights, but you're not a man. You're a beast." "Wait till I get back to Dawson," Beauty Smith threatened. "I'll have the law on you." "If you open your mouth when you get back to Dawson, I'll have you run out of town, understand?" Beauty Smith replied with a grunt. "Understand!" the other thundered with abrupt fierceness. "Yes," Beauty Smith grunted, shrinking away. "Yes, what?" "Yes, sir," Beauty Smith snarled. "Look out, he'll bite!" someone shouted, and a guffaw of laughter went up. Scott turned his back on him and returned to help the dog musher who was working over White Fang. Some of the men were already departing. Others stood in groups, looking on and talking. Tim Keenan joined one of the groups. "Who's that mug?" he asked. "Weedon Scott," someone answered. "And who the hell is Weedon Scott?" the faro dealer demanded. "Oh, one of them crackerjack mining experts. He's in with all the big bugs. If you want to keep out of trouble, you'll steer clear of him, that's my talk. He's all hunky with the officials. The Gold Commissioner's a special pal of his." "I thought he must be somebody," was the faro dealer's comment. "That's why I kept my hands off him at the start." End of Chapter 4.
Part 4, Chapter 5. The Indomitable. "It's hopeless," Weedon Scott confessed. He sat on the step of his cabin and stared at the dog musher, who responded with a shrug that was equally hopeless. Together they looked at White Fang at the end of his stretched chain, bristling, snarling, ferocious, straining to get at the sled dogs. Having received sundry lessons from Matt, said lessons being imparted by means of a club, the sled dogs had learned to leave White Fang alone, and even then they were lying down at a distance, apparently oblivious of his existence. "It's a wolf, and there's no taming it," Weedon Scott announced. "Oh, I don't know about that," Matt objected. "Might be a lot of dog in him, for all you can tell. But there's one thing I know, and that's there's no getting away from." The dog musher paused and nodded his head confidently at Moosehide Mountain. "Well, don't be a miser with what you know," Scott said sharply after waiting a suitable length of time. "Spit it out. What is it?" The dog musher indicated White Fang with a backward thrust of his thumb. "Wolf or dog, it's all the same. He's been tame ready." "No. I tell you yes, and broke the harness. Look close there. Do you see them marks across the chest?" "You're right, Matt. He was a sled dog before Beauty Smith got hold of him. And there's not much reason against his being a sled dog again." "What do you think?" Scott queried eagerly. Then the hope died down as he added, shaking his head, "We've had him 2 weeks now, and if anything, He's wilder than ever at the present moment." "Give him a chance," Matt counseled. "Turn him loose for a spell." The other looked at him incredulously. "Yes," Matt went on, "I know you've tried to, but you didn't take a club." "You try it then." The dog musher secured a club and went over to the chained animal. White Fang watched the club after the manner of a caged lion watching the whip of its trainer. "See him keep his eye on that club," Matt said. "That's a good sign. He's no fool. He doesn't dast tackle me so long as I got that club handy. He's not clean crazy, sure." As the man's hand approached his neck, White Fang bristled and snarled and crouched down. But while he eyed the approaching hand, he at the same time contrived to keep track of the club in the other hand, suspended threateningly above him. Matt unsnapped the chain from the collar and stepped back. White Fang could scarcely realize that he was free. Many months had gone by since he passed into the possession of Beauty Smith, and in all that period he had never known a moment of freedom except at the times he had been loosed to fight with the other dogs. Immediately after such fights, he had always been imprisoned again. He did not know what to make of it. Perhaps some new devilry of the gods was about to be perpetrated on him. He walked slowly and cautiously, prepared to be assailed at any moment. He did not know what to do. It was all so unprecedented. He took the precaution to sheer off from the two watching gods, and walked carefully to the corner of the cabin. Nothing happened. He was plainly perplexed, and he came back again, pausing a dozen feet away and regarding the two men intently. "Won't he run away?" his new owner asked. Matt shrugged his shoulders. "Got to take a gamble. Only way to find out is to find out." "Poor devil," Scott murmured pityingly. "What he needs is some show of human kindness," he added, turning and going into the cabin. He came out with a piece of meat, which he tossed to White Fang. He sprang away from it, and from a distance studied it suspiciously. "Hiya, Major!" Matt shouted warningly, but it was too late. Major had made a spring for the meat. At the instant his jaws closed on it, White Fang struck him. He was overthrown. Matt rushed in, but quicker than he was White Fang. Major staggered to his feet, but the blood spouting from his throat reddened the snow in a widening path. "It's too bad, but it served him right," Scott said hastily. But Matt's foot had already started on its way to kick White Fang. There was a leap, a flash of teeth, a sharp exclamation. White Fang, snarling fiercely, scrambled backward for several yards, while Matt stooped and investigated his leg. "He got me all right," he announced, pointing to the torn trousers and underclothes and the growing stain of red. "I told you it was hopeless, Matt," Scott said in a discouraged voice. "I've thought about it off and on, while not wanting to think of it. But we've come to it now. It's the only thing to do." As he talked, with reluctant movements he drew his revolver, threw open the cylinder, and assured himself of its contents. "Look here, Mr. Scott," Matt objected. "That dog's been through hell. You can't expect him to come out a white and shining angel. Give him time." "Look at Major," the other rejoined. The dog musher surveyed the stricken dog. He had sunk down on the snow in the circle of his blood, and was plainly in the last gasp. "Served him right. You said so yourself, Mr. Scott. He tried to take White Fang's meat, and he's dead-o. That was to be expected. I wouldn't give 2 hoops in hell for a dog who wouldn't fight for his own meat. But look at yourself, Matt. It's all right about the dogs, but we must draw the line somewhere." "Served me right," Matt argued stubbornly. "What'd I want to kick him for? You said yourself that he'd done right. Then I had no right to kick him." "It would be a mercy to kill him," Scott insisted. "He's untamable." "Now look here, Mr. Scott. Give the poor devil a fighting chance. He ain't had no chance yet. He's just come through hell, and this is the first time he's been loose. Give him a fair chance, and if he don't deliver the goods, I'll kill him myself. There." "God knows I don't want to kill him, or have him killed," Scott answered, putting away the revolver. "We'll let him run loose and see what kindness can do for him. And here's a try at it." He walked over to White Fang and began talking to him gently and soothingly. "Better have a club handy," Matt warned. Scott shook his head and went on trying to win White Fang's confidence. White Fang was suspicious. Something was impending. He had killed this god's dog, bitten his companion god, and what else was to be expected than some terrible punishment? But in the face of it, he was indomitable. He bristled and showed his teeth, his eyes vigilant, his whole body wary and prepared for anything. The god had no club, so he suffered him to approach quite near. The god's hand came out and was descending upon his head. White Fang shrank together and grew tense as he crouched under it. Here was danger, some treachery or something. He knew the hands of the gods, their proved mastery, their cunning to hurt. Besides, there was his old antipathy to being touched. He snarled more menacingly, crouched still lower, and still the hand descended. He did not want to bite the hand, and he endured the peril of it until his instinct surged up in him, mastering him with its insatiable yearning for life. Weedon Scott had believed that he was quick enough to avoid any snap or slash, but he had yet to learn the remarkable quickness of White Fang, who struck with the certainty and swiftness of a coiled snake. Scott cried out sharply with surprise, catching his torn hand and holding it tightly in his other hand. Matt uttered a great oath and sprang to his side. White Fang crouched down and backed away, bristling, showing his fangs, his eyes malignant with menace. Now he could expect a beating as fearful as any he had received from Beauty Smith. "Here! What are you doing?" Scott cried suddenly. Matt had dashed into the cabin and come out with a rifle. "Nothing," he said slowly, with a careless calmness that was assumed. "Only going to keep that promise I made. I reckon it's up to me to kill him, as I said I'd do." "No, you don't." "Yes, I do. Watch me." As Matt had pleaded for White Fang when he had been bitten, it was now Weedon Scott's turn to plead. "You said to give him a chance. Well, give it to him. We've only just started, and we can't quit at the beginning. It served me right this time, and... look at him!" White Fang, near the corner of the cabin, and 40 feet away, was snarling with blood-curdling viciousness, not at Scott, but at the dog musher. "Well, I'll be everlastingly goshwoggled, was the dog musher's expression of astonishment. Look at the intelligence of him, Scott went on hastily. He knows the meaning of firearms as well as you do. He's got intelligence, and we've got to give that intelligence a chance. Put up the gun. All right, I'm willing, Matt agreed, leaning the rifle against the woodpile. But will you look at that? He exclaimed the next moment. White Fang had quieted down and ceased snarling. This is worth investigating. Watch! Matt reached for the rifle, and at the same moment White Fang snarled. He stepped away from the rifle, and White Fang's lifted lips descended, covering his teeth. Now, just for fun. Matt took the rifle and began slowly to raise it to his shoulder. White Fang's snarling began with the movement and increased as the movement approached its culmination. But the moment before the rifle came to a level on him, he leaped sideways behind the corner of the cabin. Matt stood staring along the sights at the empty space of snow which had been occupied by White Fang. The dog musher put the rifle down solemnly, then turned and looked at his employer. I agree with you, Mr. Scott. That dog's too intelligent to kill. End of Part 4, Chapter 5. Part 4, Chapter 6. The Love Master. As White Fang watched Reed and Scott approach, he bristled and snarled to advertise that he would not submit to punishment. 24 hours had passed since he had slashed open the hand that was now bandaged and held up by a sling to keep the blood out of it. In the past, White Fang had experienced delayed punishments, and he apprehended that such a one was about to befall him. How could it be otherwise? He had committed what was to him sacrilege, sunk his fangs into the holy flesh of a god, and of a white-skinned superior god at that. In the nature of things, and of intercourse with gods, something terrible awaited him. The god sat several feet away. White Fang could see nothing dangerous in that. When the gods administered punishment, they stood on their legs. Besides, this god had no club, no whip, no firearm, and furthermore, he himself was free. No chain nor stick bound him. He could escape into safety while the god was scrambling to his feet. In the meantime, he would wait and see. The god remained quiet, made no movement, and White Fang's snarl slowly dwindled to a growl that ebbed down in his throat and ceased. Then the god spoke, and at the first sound of his voice, the hair rose on White Fang's neck, and the growl rushed up in his throat. But the god made no hostile movement, and went on calmly talking. For a time, White Fang growled in unison with him, a correspondence of rhythm being established between growl and voice. But the god talked on interminably. He talked to White Fang as White Fang had never been talked to before. He talked softly and soothingly, with a gentleness that somehow, somewhere, touched White Fang. In spite of himself and all the prickling warnings of his instinct, White Fang began to have confidence in this god. He had a feeling of security that was belied by all his experience with men. After a long time, The god got up and went into the cabin. White Fang scanned him apprehensively when he came out. He had neither whip nor club nor weapon, nor was his uninjured hand behind his back hiding something. He sat down as before, in the same spot, several feet away. He held out a small piece of meat. White Fang pricked his ears and investigated it suspiciously, managing to look at the same time both at the meat and the god, alert for any overt act, his body tense and ready to spring away at the first sign of hostility. Still, the punishment delayed. The god merely held near to his nose a piece of meat, and about the meat there seemed to be nothing wrong. Still White Fang suspected, and though the meat was proffered to him with short inviting thrusts of the hand, he refused to touch it. The gods were all-wise, and there was no telling what masterful treachery lurked behind that apparently harmless piece of meat. In past experience, especially in dealing with squaws, meat and punishment had often been disastrously related. In the end, the god tossed the meat on the snow at White Fang's feet. He smelled the meat carefully, but he did not look at it. While he smelled it, he kept his eyes on the god. Nothing happened. He took the meat into his mouth and swallowed it. Still, nothing happened. The god was actually offering him another piece of meat. Again, he refused to take it from the hand, and again it was tossed to him. This was repeated a number of times. But there came a time when the god refused to toss it. He kept it in his hand and steadfastly proffered it. The meat was good meat, and White Fang was hungry. Bit by bit, infinitely cautious, he approached the hand. At last the time came that he decided to eat the meat from the hand. He never took his eyes from the god, thrusting his head forward with ears flattened back and hair involuntarily rising and cresting on his neck. Also, a low growl rumbled in his throat as warning that he was not to be trifled with. He ate the meat, and nothing happened. Piece by piece, he ate all the meat, and nothing happened. Still, the punishment delayed. He licked his chops and waited. The god went on talking. In his voice was kindness, something of which White Fang had no experience whatever, and within him it aroused feelings which he had likewise never experienced before. He was aware of a certain strange satisfaction, as though some need were being gratified, as though some void in his being were being filled. Then again came the prod of his instinct and the warning of past experience. The gods were ever crafty, and they had unguessed ways of attaining their ends. Ah, he had thought so. There it came now, the god's hand, cunning to hurt, thrusting out at him, descending upon his head. God went on talking. His voice was soft and soothing. In spite of the menacing hand, the voice inspired confidence, and in spite of the assuring voice, the hand inspired distrust. White Fang was torn by conflicting feelings, impulses. It seemed he would fly to pieces, So terrible was the control he was exerting, holding together by unwonted indecision the counterforces that struggled within him for mastery. He compromised. He snarled and bristled and flattened his ears. But he neither snapped nor sprang away. The hand descended. Nearer and nearer it came. It touched the ends of his upstanding hair. He shrank down under it. It followed down after him, pressing more closely against him. Shrinking, almost shivering, he still managed to hold himself together. It was a torment, this hand that touched him and violated his instinct. He could not forget in a day all the evil that had been wrought him at the hands of men. But it was the will of the god, and he strove to submit. The hand lifted and descended again in a patting, caressing movement. This continued, but every time the hand lifted, the hair lifted under it, and every time the hand descended, the ears flattened down, and a cavernous growl surged in his throat. White Fang growled and growled with insistent warning. By this means he announced that he was prepared to retaliate for any hurt he might receive. There was no telling when the god's ulterior motive might be disclosed. At any moment that soft, confidence-inspiring voice might break forth in a roar of wrath. That gentle and caressing hand transform itself into a vice-like grip to hold him helpless and administer punishment. But the god talked on softly, and ever the hand rose and fell with non-hostile pats. White Fang experienced dual feelings. It was distasteful to his instinct. It restrained him, opposed the will of him toward personal liberty. And yet it was not physically painful. On the contrary, it was even pleasant in a physical way. The patting movement slowly and carefully changed to a rubbing of the ears about their bases, and the physical pleasure even increased a little. Yet he continued to fear, and stood on guard, expectant of unguessed evil, alternatively suffering and enjoying, as one feeling or the other came uppermost and swayed him. "Well, I'll be goshwoggled!" So spoke Matt, coming out of the cabin, his sleeves rolled up, a pan of dirty dishwater in his hands, arrested in the act of emptying the pan by the sight of Weedon Scott patting White Fang. At the instant his voice broke the silence, White Fang leaped back, snarling savagely at him. Matt regarded his employer with grieved disapproval. "If you don't mind my expressin' my feelin's, Mr. Scott, I'll make free to say you're 17 kinds of a damn fool, and all of 'em different. And then some." Weedon Scott smiled with a superior air, gained his feet, and walked over to White Fang. He talked soothingly to him, but not for long, then slowly put out his hand, rested it on White Fang's head, and resumed the interrupted patting. White Fang endured it, keeping his eyes fixed suspiciously, not upon the man that patted him, but upon the man that stood in the doorway. "You may be a #1 tip-top mining expert, all right," the dog musher delivered himself oracularly, "but you missed the chance of your life when you was a boy and didn't run off and join a circus." White Fang snarled at the sound of his voice, but this time did not leap away from under the hand that was caressing his head and the back of his neck with long, soothing strokes. It was the beginning of the end for White Fang. The ending of the old life and the reign of hate. A new and incomprehensibly fairer life was dawning. It required much thinking and endless patience on the part of Weedon Scott to accomplish this. And on the part of White Fang, it required nothing less than a revolution. He had to ignore the urges and promptings of instinct and reason, defy experience, give the lie to life itself. Life, as he had known it, not only had had no place in it for much that he now did, but all the currents had gone counter to those to which he now abandoned himself. In short, when all things were considered, he had to achieve an orientation far vaster than the one he had achieved at the time he came voluntarily in from the wild and accepted Grey Beaver as his lord. At that time he was a mere puppy, soft from the making, without form, ready for the thumb of circumstance to begin its work upon him. But now it was different. The thumb of circumstance had done its work only too well. By it he had been formed and hardened into the fighting wolf, fierce and implacable, unloving and unlovable. To accomplish the change was like a reflux of being, and this when the plasticity of youth was no longer his. When the fiber of him had become tough and knotty. When the warp and woof of him had made of him an adamantine texture, harsh and unyielding. When the face of his spirit had become iron, and all his instincts and axioms had crystallized into set rules, cautions, dislikes, and desires. Yet again, in this new orientation, it was the thumb of circumstance that pressed and prodded him, softening that which had become hard and remolding it into fairer form. Weedon Scott was in truth this thumb. He had gone to the roots of White Fang's nature, and with kindness touched to life potencies that had languished and well nigh perished. One such potency was love. It took the place of like, which latter had been the highest feeling that thrilled him in his intercourse with the gods. But this love did not come in a day. It began with like, and out of it slowly developed. White Fang did not run away, though he was allowed to remain loose, because he liked this new god. This was certainly better than the life he had lived in the cage of Beauty Smith, and it was necessary that he should have some god. The lordship of man was a need of his nature. The seal of his dependence on man had been set upon him in that early day when he turned his back on the wild and crawled to Grey Beaver's feet to receive the expected beating. This seal had been stamped upon him again and ineradicably on his second return from the wild, when the long famine was over, and there was fish once more in the village of Grey Beaver. And so, because he needed a god, and because he preferred Weedon Scott to Beauty Smith, White Fang remained. In acknowledgment of fealty, he proceeded to take upon himself the guardianship of his master's property. He prowled about the cabin while the sled dogs slept, and the first night visitor to the cabin fought him off with a club until Weedon Scott came to the rescue. But White Fang soon learned to differentiate between thieves and honest men, to appraise the true value of step and carriage. the man who traveled, loud-stepping, the direct line to the cabin door, he let alone, though he watched him vigilantly until the door opened and he received the endorsement of the master. But the man who went softly, by circuitous ways, peering with caution, seeking after secrecy, that was the man who received no suspension of judgment from White Fang, and who went away abruptly, hurriedly, and without dignity. Weedon Scott had set himself the task of redeeming White Fang, or rather of redeeming mankind from the wrong it had done White Fang. It was a matter of principle and conscience. He felt that the ill done White Fang was a debt incurred by man, and that it must be paid. So he went out of his way to be especially kind to the fighting wolf. Each day he made it a point to caress and pet White Fang, and to do it at length. At first suspicious and hostile, White Fang grew to like this petting. But there was one thing that he never outgrew, his growling. Growl he would from the moment the petting began till it ended. But it was a growl with a new note in it. A stranger could not hear this note, and to such a stranger the growling of White Fang was an exhibition of primordial savagery, nerve-wracking and blood-curdling. But White Fang's throat had become harsh-fibred from the making of ferocious sounds through the many years since his first little rasp of anger in the lair of his cubhood, and he could not soften the sounds of that throat now to express the gentleness he felt. Nevertheless, Weedon Scott's ear and sympathy were fine enough to catch the new note, all but drowned in the fierceness, the note that was the faintest hint of a croon of content, and that none but he could hear. As the days went by, the evolution of like into love was accelerated. White Fang himself began to grow aware of it, though in his consciousness he knew not what love was. It manifested itself to him as a void in his being, a hungry, aching, yearning void that clamored to be filled. It was a pain and an unrest, and it received easement only by the touch of the new God's presence. At such times love was a joy to him, a wild, keen, thrilling satisfaction. But when away from his God, the pain and the unrest returned. The void in him sprang up and pressed against him with its emptiness, and the hunger gnawed and gnawed unceasingly. White Fang was in the process of finding himself. In spite of the maturity of his years, and of the savage rigidity of the mold that had formed him, his nature was undergoing an expansion. There was a burgeoning within him of strange feelings and unwanted impulses. His old code of conduct was changing. In the past, he had liked comfort and surceased from pain, disliked discomfort and pain, and had adjusted his actions accordingly. But now it was different. Because of this new feeling within him, he ofttimes elected discomfort and pain for the sake of his God. Thus, in early morning, instead of roaming and foraging, or lying in a sheltered nook, he would wait for hours on the cheerless cabin stoop for a sight of the God's face. At night, when the God returned home, White Fang would leave the warm sleeping place he had burrowed in the snow in order to receive the friendly snap of fingers and the word of greeting. Meat, Even meat itself he would forego to be with his God, to receive a caress from him, or to accompany him down into the town. Like had been replaced by love. And love was the plummet dropped down into the deeps of him where like had never gone. And responsive out of his deeps had come the new thing, love. That which was given unto him did he return. This was a God indeed, a love God, a warm and radiant God, in whose light White Fang's nature expanded as a flower expands under the sun. But White Fang was not demonstrative. He was too old, too firmly molded to become adept at expressing himself in new ways. He was too self-possessed, too strongly poised in his own isolation. Too long had he cultivated reticence, aloofness, and moroseness. He had never barked in his life, and he could not now learn to bark a welcome when his God approached. He was never in the way, never extravagant nor foolish in the expression of his love. He never ran to meet his God. He waited at a distance. But he always waited, was always there. His love partook of the nature of worship, dumb, inarticulate, a silent adoration. Only by the steady regard of his eyes did he express his love, and by the unceasing following with his eyes of his God's every movement. Also at times, when his God looked at him and spoke to him, he betrayed an awkward self-consciousness caused by the struggle of his love to express itself and his physical inability to express it. He learned to adjust himself in many ways to his new mode of life. It was borne in upon him that he must let his master's dogs alone. Yet his dominant nature asserted itself, and he had first to thrash them into an acknowledgment of his superiority and leadership. This accomplished, he had little trouble with them. They gave trail to him when he came and went or walked among them, and when he asserted his will, they obeyed. In the same way, he came to tolerate Matt as a possession of his master. His master rarely fed him. Matt did that. It was his business. Yet White Fang divined it was his master's food he ate, and that it was his master who thus fed him vicariously. Matt it was who tried to put him into the harness and make him haul sled with the other dogs. But Matt failed. It was not until Weedon Scott put the harness on White Fang and worked him that he understood. He took it as his master's will that Matt should drive him and work him just as he drove and worked his master's other dogs. Different from the Mackenzie toboggans were the Klondike sleds with runners under them, and different was the method of driving the dogs. There was no fan formation of the team. Dogs worked in single file, one behind another, hauling on double traces. And here, in the Klondike, the leader was indeed the leader. The wisest as well as the strongest dog was the leader, and the team obeyed him and feared him. That White Fang should quickly gain this post was inevitable. He could not be satisfied with less, as Matt learned after much inconvenience and trouble. White Fang picked out the post for himself, and Matt backed his judgment with strong language after the experiment had been tried. But, though he worked in the sled in the day, White Fang did not forego the guarding of his master's property in the night. Thus he was on duty all the time, ever vigilant, and faithful, the most valuable of all the dogs. "Make him free to spit out what's in me," Matt said one day. "I beg to state that you was a wise guy all right when you paid the price you did for that dog. You clean swindled Beauty Smith, on top of pushing in his face with your fist." A recrudescence of anger glinted in Weedon Scott's gray eyes, and he muttered savagely, "The beast!" In the late spring, a great trouble came to White Fang. Without warning, the love-master disappeared. There had been warning, but White Fang was unversed in such things, and did not understand the packing of a grip. He remembered afterwards that his packing had preceded the master's disappearance, but at the time he suspected nothing. That night he waited for the master to return. At midnight, the chill wind that blew drove him to shelter at the rear of the cabin. There he drowsed, only half asleep, his ears keyed for the first sound of the familiar step. But at 2 in the morning, his anxiety drove him out to the cold front stoop, where he crouched and waited. But no master came. In the morning the door opened, and Matt stepped outside. White Fang gazed at him wistfully. There was no common speech by which he might learn what he wanted to know. The days came and went, but never the master. White Fang, who had never known sickness in his life, became sick. He became very sick, so sick that Matt was finally compelled to bring him inside the cabin. Also, in writing his employer, Matt devoted a postscript to White Fang. Weedon Scott, reading the letter down in Circle City, came upon the following. "That damn wolf won't work. Won't eat. Ain't got no spunk left. All the dogs is licking him. Wants to know what has become of you, and I don't know how to tell him. Maybe he is going to die." It was as Matt had said. White Fang had ceased eating, lost heart, and allowed every dog of the team to thrash him. In the cabin, he lay on the floor near the stove, without interest in food, in Matt, nor in life. Matt might talk gently to him, or swear at him. It was all the same. He never did more than turn his dull eyes upon the man, then drop his head back to its customary position on his forepaws. And then, one night, Matt, reading to himself with moving lips and mumbled sounds, was startled by a low whine from White Fang. He had got upon his feet, his ears cocked towards the door, and he was listening intently. A moment later, Matt heard a footstep. The door opened, and Weedon Scott stepped in. The two men shook hands. Then Scott looked around the room. "Where's the wolf?" he asked. Then he discovered him, standing where he had been lying, near the stove. He had not rushed forward after the manner of other dogs. He stood, watching and waiting. "Holy smoke!" Matt exclaimed. "Look at him wag his tail!" Weedon Scott strode halfway across the room toward him, at the same time calling him. White Fang came to him, not with a great bound, yet quickly. He was awakened from self-consciousness, but as he drew near, his eyes took on a strange expression. Something, an incommunicable vastness of feeling, rose up into his eyes as a light, and shone forth. "He never looked at me that way all the time you was gone," Matt commented. Weedon Scott did not hear. He was squatting down on his heels, face to face with White Fang, and petting him, rubbing at the roots of his ears, making long caressing strokes down the neck to the shoulders,
tapping the spine gently with the balls of his fingers, and White Fang was growling responsively, the crooning note of the growl more pronounced than ever. But that was not all. What of his joy? The great love in him, ever surging and struggling to express itself, succeeding in finding a new mode of expression. He suddenly thrust his head forward and nudged his way in between the master's arm and body. And here, confined, hidden from view all except his ears, no longer growling, he continued to nudge and snuggle. The two men looked at each other. Scott's eyes were shining. "Gosh!" said Matt in an awe-stricken voice. A moment later, when he had recovered himself, he said, "I always insisted that that wolf was a dog. Look at him." With the return of the Love Master, White Fang's recovery was rapid. 2 nights and a day he spent in the cabin. Then he sallied forth. The sled dogs had forgotten his prowess. They remembered only the latest, which was his weakness and sickness. At the sight of him, as he came out of the cabin, they sprang upon him. "Talk about your roughhouses," Matt murmured gleefully, standing in the doorway and looking on. "Give 'em hell, you wolf! Give 'em hell! And then some!" White Fang did not need the encouragement. The return of the Love Master was enough. Life was flowing through him again, splendid and indomitable. He fought from sheer joy, finding it an expression of much that he had felt and that otherwise was without speech. There could be but one ending. The team dispersed in ignominious defeat, and it was not until after dark that the dogs came sneaking back, one, by meekness and humility signifying their fealty to White Fang. Having learned to snuggle, White Fang was guilty of it often. It was the final word. He could not go beyond it. The one thing which he had always been particularly jealous was his head. He had always disliked to have it touched. It was the wild in him, fear of hurt and of the trap, that had given rise to the panicky impulses to avoid contacts. It was the mandate of his instinct that his head must be free. And now, with the Love Master, his snuggling was a deliberate act of putting himself into a position of hopelessness. It was an expression of perfect confidence, of absolute self-surrender, as though he said, "I put myself into thy hands. Work thou thy will with me." One night, not long after the return, Scott and Matt sat at a game of cribbage preliminary to going to bed. 15-2, 15-4, and a pair makes 6. Matt was pegging up, when there was an outcry and a sound of snarling without. They looked at each other as they started to rise to their feet. "The wolf's nailed somebody," Matt said. A wild scream of fear and anguish hastened them. "Bring a light," Scott shouted as he sprang outside. Matt followed with the lamp, and by its light they saw a man lying on his back in the snow. His arms were folded, one above the other, across his face and throat. Thus he was trying to shield himself from White Fang's teeth. And there was need for it. White Fang was in a rage, wickedly making his attack on the most vulnerable spot. From shoulder to wrist of the crossed arms, the coat sleeve, blue flannel shirt, and undershirt were ripped in rags, while the arms themselves were terribly slashed, and streaming blood. All this the two men saw in the first instant. The next instant, Weed and Scott had White Fang by the throat, and was dragging him clear. White Fang struggled and snarled, but made no attempt to bite, while he quickly quieted down at a sharp word from the master. Matt helped the man to his feet. As he rose, he lowered his crossed arms, exposing the bestial face of Beauty Smith. The dog musher let him go precipitately, with action similar to that of a man who has picked up live fire. Beauty Smith blinked in the lamplight and looked about him. He caught sight of White Fang, and terror rushed into his face. At the same moment, Matt noticed two objects lying in the snow. He held the lamp close to them, indicating them with his toe for his employer's benefit: a steel dog chain and a stout club. Weedon Scott saw and nodded. Not a word was spoken. The dog musher laid his hand on Beauty Smith's shoulder and faced him to right about. No word needed to be spoken. Beauty Smith started. In the meantime, the love master was patting White Fang and talking to him. "Tried to steal ye, eh? And you wouldn't have it. Well, well, he made a mistake, didn't he? Must have thought he had a hold of 17 devils," the dog musher sniggered. White Fang, still wrought up and bristling, growled and growled, the hair slowly lying down, the crooning note remote and dim, but growing in his throat. End of Part 4, Chapter 6.
White Fang by Jack London. Part 5, Chapter 1, The Long Trail. It was in the air. White Fang sensed the coming calamity even before there was tangible evidence of it. In vague ways it was borne in upon him that a change was impending. He knew not how nor why, yet he got his feel of the oncoming event from the gods themselves. In ways subtler than they knew, they betrayed their intentions to the wolf-dog that haunted the cabin stoop, and that, though he never came inside, the cabin knew what went on inside their brains. "Listen to that, will you?" the dog musher exclaimed at supper one night. Weedon Scott listened. Through the door came a low, anxious whine, like a sobbing under the breath that had just grown audible. Then came the long sniff, as White Fang reassured himself that his god was still inside and had not yet taken himself off into the mysterious and solitary flight. "I do believe that wolf's on to you," the dog musher said. Weedon Scott looked across at his companion with eyes that almost pleaded, though this was given the lie by his words. "What the devil can I do with a wolf in California?" he demanded. "That's what I say," Matt answered. "What the devil can you do with a wolf in California?" But this did not satisfy Weedon Scott. The others seemed to be judging him in a non-committal sort of way. "White man's dog would have no show against him," Scott went on. "He'd kill them on sight. If he didn't bankrupt me with damage suits, the authorities would take him away from me and electrocute him." "He's a downright murderer, I know," was the dog musher's comment. Weedon Scott looked at him suspiciously. "It would never do," he said decisively. "It would never do," Matt concurred. "Why, you'd have to hire a man special to take care of 'em." The other's suspicion was allied. He nodded cheerfully. In the silence that followed, the low, half-sobbing whine was heard at the door, and then the long, questing sniff. "There's no denying he thinks a hell of a lot of you," Matt said. The other glared at him in sudden wrath. "Damn it all, man, I know my own mind and what's best. I'm agreeing with you, only what? Only—" The dog musher began softly, then changed his mind and betrayed a rising anger of his own. "Well, you needn't get all fired up and heated about it. Judging by your actions, one'd think you didn't know your own mind." Weedon Scott debated with himself for a while, and then said more gently, "You're right, Matt. I don't know my own mind, and that's what's the trouble. Why, it would be rank ridiculous for me to take that dog along," he broke out after another pause. "I'm agreeing with you," was Matt's answer, and again his employer was not quite satisfied with him. "But how in the name of the great Sardanapalus he knows you're going is what gets me," the dog musher continued innocently. "It's beyond me, Matt," Scott answered, with a mournful shake of the head. Then came the day when, through the open cabin door, White Fang saw the fateful grip on the floor and the Love Master packing things into it. Also, there were comings and goings, and the erstwhile placid atmosphere of the cabin was vexed with strange perturbations and unrest. Here was indubitably evidence. White Fang had already scented it. He now reasoned it. His god was preparing for another flight, and since he had not taken him with him before, so now he could look to be left behind. That night he lifted the long wolf howl, as he howled in his puppy days, when he had fled back from the wild to the village to find it vanished, and not but a rubbish heap to mark the site of Grey Beaver's teepee. So now he pointed his muzzle to the cold stars and told them his woe. Inside the cabin, 2 men had just gone to bed. "He's gone off his food again," Matt remarked from his bunk. There was a grunt from Weedon Scott's bunk and a stir of blankets. "From the way he cut up the other time you went away, I wouldn't wonder this time but what he died." The blanket in the other bunk stirred irritably. "Oh, shut up!" Scott cried out through the darkness. "You nag worse than a woman." "I'm agreeing with you," the dog musher answered, and Weedon Scott was not quite sure whether or not he had snickered. The next day, White Fang's anxiety and restlessness were even more pronounced. He dogged his master's heels whenever he left the cabin, and haunted the front stoop when he remained inside. Through the open door he could catch glimpses of the luggage on the floor. The grip had been joined by 2 large canvas bags and a box. Matt was rolling the master's blankets and fur robes inside a small tarpaulin. White Fang whined as he watched the operation. Later on, 2 Indians arrived. He watched them closely as they shouldered the luggage and were led off down the hill by Matt, who carried the bedding and the grip. But White Fang did not follow them. The master was still in the cabin. After a time Matt returned. The master came to the door and called White Fang inside. "You poor devil," he gently said, rubbing White Fang's ears and tapping his spine. "I'm hitting the long trail, old man, where you cannot follow. Now give me a good growl, the last goodbye growl." But White Fang refused to growl. Instead, after a wistful, searching look, he snuggled in, burrowed his head out of sight between the master's arms and body. "There she blows!" Matt cried. From the Yukon arose the hoarsest bellowing of a river steamboat. "You've got to cut it short. Be sure to lock the front door, or I'll go out the back. Get a move on." The 2 doors slammed at the same moment, and Weedon Scott waited for Matt to come around the front. From inside the cabin door, a low whining and sobbing. Then there was long, deep-drawn sniffs. "You must take good care of him, Matt," Scott said as they started down the hill. "Write me and let me know how he gets along." "Sure," the dog musher answered. "But listen to that, will ya?" Both men stopped. White Fang was howling as dogs howl when their masters lie dead. He was voicing an utter woe, his cries bursting upward in great, heart-breaking rushes, dying down into quivering misery, and bursting upward again with a rush upon rush of grief. The Aurora was the first steamboat of the year for the outside, and her decks were jammed with prosperous adventurers and broken gold-seekers, all equally as mad to get to the outside as they had been originally to get to the inside. Near the gangplank, Scott was shaking hands with Matt, who was preparing to go ashore. But Matt's hands went limp in the other's grasp as his gaze shot past and remained fixed on something behind him. Scott turned to see. Sitting on the deck, several feet away, and watching wistfully, was White Fang. The dog musher swore softly in awe-stricken accents. Scott could only look in wonder. "Did you lock the front door?" Matt demanded. The other nodded and asked, "How about the back?" "You bet I did," was the fervent reply. White Fang flattened his ears ingratiatingly, but remained where he was, making no attempt to approach. "I'll have to take him ashore with me." Matt made a couple of steps towards White Fang, but the latter slid away from him. The dog-musher made a rush of it, and White Fang dodged between the legs of a group of men. Ducking, turning, doubling, he slid about the deck, eluding the others' efforts to capture him. But when the love-master spoke, White Fang came to him with prompt obedience. "Won't come to the hand that feed 'em all these months," the dog-musher muttered resentfully. "And you ain't never fed him after the first day of getting acquainted. I'm blamed if I can see how we worked out that you're the boss." Scott, who had been patting White Fang, suddenly bent closer and pointed out fresh-made cuts on his muzzle and a gash between the eyes. Matt bent over and passed his hand along White Fang's belly. "We plumb forgot about the window. He's all cut up and gouged underneath. Must have butted clean through it, by gosh." But Weedon Scott was not listening. He was thinking rapidly. The Aurora's whistle hooted a final announcement of departure. Men were scurrying down the gangplank to the shore. Matt loosened the bandana from his own neck and started to put it around White Fang's. Scott grasped the dog-musher's hands. "Goodbye, Matt, old man. About the wolf, you needn't write. You see, I've—" "What?" the dog-musher exploded. "You don't mean to say—" "The very thing I mean. Here's your bandana. I'll write you about him." Matt paused halfway down the gangplank. "He'll never stand the climate," shouted back, "unless you clip him in the warm weather." The gangplank was hauled in, and the Aurora swung out from the bank. Weedon Scott waved a last goodbye. Then he turned and bent over White Fang, standing by his side. "Now growl, damn you, growl," he said as he patted the responsive head and rubbed the flattening ears. End of Part 5, Chapter 1. White Fang by Jack London. Part 5, Chapter 2. The Southland. White Fang landed from the steamer in San Francisco. He was appalled. Deep in him, below any reasoning process or act of consciousness, he had associated power with godhead. And never had the white man seemed such a marvelous god as now, when he trod the slimy pavement of San Francisco. The log cabins he had known were replaced by towering buildings. The streets were crowded with perils. Wagons, carts, automobiles, great straining horses pulling huge trucks, and monstrous cable and electric cars hooting and clanging through the midst, screeching their instant menace after the manner of the lynx he had known in the Northwoods. All this was manifest of power. Through it all, behind it all was man, governing and controlling, expressing himself as of old by his mastery over matter. It was colossal, stunning. White Fang was awed. Fear sat upon him. As in his cubhood he had been made to feel his smallness and puniness on the day he first came in from the wild to the village of Gray Beaver, so now, in his full-grown stature and pride of strength, he was made to feel small and puny. And there were so many gods. He was made dizzy by the swarming of them. The thunder of the streets smote upon his ears. He was bewildered by the tremendous and endless rush and movement of things. As never before, he felt his dependency on the love-master, close at whose heels he followed, no matter where he happened, never losing sight of him. But White Fang was to have no more than a nightmare vision of the city, an experience that was like a bad dream, unreal and terrible, that haunted him for long after in his dreams. He was put into a baggage car by the master, chained in a corner in the midst of a heaped trunk of vials. Here a squat and brawny godhead always, with much noise, hurled trunks and boxes about, dragging them in through the door and tossing them into the piles, or flinging them out of the door, smashing and crashing to the other gods who awaited them. And here, in this inferno of luggage, was White Fang, deserted by the master. Or at least White Fang thought he was deserted, until he smelled out the master's canvas clothes-bags alongside him, and proceeded to mount guard over them. "'Bout time you come," growled the god of the car an hour later, when Weedon Scott appeared at the door. "That dog of yours won't lay a finger on your stuff." White Fang emerged from the car. He was astonished. The nightmare city was gone. The car had been to him no more than a room in a house, and when he entered in the city had been all around him. In the interval, the city had disappeared. The roar of it no longer dinned upon his ears. Before him was smiling country, streaming with sunshine, lazy with quietude. But he had little time to marvel at the transformation. He accepted it, as he accepted all the unacceptable doings and manifestations of the gods. It was their way. There was a carriage waiting. A man and a woman approached the master. The woman's arms went out and clutched the master around the neck. A hostile act. The next moment, Weedon Scott had torn loose from the embrace and closed with White Fang, who had become a snarling, raging demon. "It's all right, Mother," Scott was saying as he kept tight hold of White Fang and placated him. "He thought you were going to injure me. He wouldn't stand for it. It's all right. It's all right. He'll learn soon enough. And in the meantime, may I be permitted to love my son when his dog is not around?" she laughed, though she was pale and weak from the fright. She looked at White Fang, who snarled and bristled and glared malevolently. "He'll have to learn, and he shall, without postponement," Scott said. He spoke softly to White Fang until he quieted him. Then his voice became firm. "Down, sir! Down with you!" This had been one of the things taught to him by the master, and White Fang obeyed, though he laid down reluctantly and sullenly. "Now, Mother!" Scott opened his arms to her, but kept his eyes on White Fang. "Down!" he warned. "Down!" White Fang bristled silently, half crouching as he rose, sank back and watched the hostile act repeated. But no harm came of it, nor of the embrace from the stranger man-god that followed. Then the clothes bags were taken in the carriage, the strange gods of the love-master followed, and White Fang pursued, now running vigilantly behind, now bristling up to the running horses, and warning them that he was there to see no harm befell the god that they dragged so swiftly across the earth. At the end of 15 minutes the carriage swung into a stone gate and on behind a double row of anchored and interlaced walnut trees. On either side stretched lawns, their broad sweep broke here and there by great sturdy limb oaks. In the near distance, in contrast with the young green of the tender grass, sunburnt hayfield shone tan and gold, while beyond were the tawny hills and upland pastures. From the head of the lawn, on the first soft swell from the valley level, looked down the deep porched, many-window house. Little opportunity was given White Fang to see all of this. Hardly had he the courage to enter the grounds when he was set upon by a sheepdog, bright-eyed, sharp-muzzled, righteously indignant and angry. It was between him and the master, cutting him off. White Fang snarled, not warning, but his hair bristled as he made his silent and deadly rush. This rush was never completed. He halted with awkward abruptness, with stiff forelegs, bracing himself against his momentum, almost sitting down on his haunches. So desirous was he avoiding contact with the dog he was in the act of attacking. It was a female, and the law of his kind thrust a barrier between. For him to attack her would require nothing less than a violation of his instinct. But with the sheepdog it was otherwise. Being a female, she possessed no such instinct. On the other hand, being a sheepdog, her instinctive fear of the wild, especially of the wolf, was unusually keen. White Fang was a wolf to her, the hereditary murderer who had preyed upon her flocks from the time sheep were first herded and guarded by some dim ancestor of hers. And so, as he abandoned his rush at her and braced himself to avoid the contact, she sprang upon him. He snarled involuntarily as he felt her teeth in his shoulder, but beyond this made no offer to hurt her. He backed away, stiff-legged with self-consciousness, and tried to go around her. He dodged this way and that, and curved and turned, but to no purpose. She remained always between him and the way he wanted to go. "Here, collie," called the strange man in the carriage. Weedon Scott laughed. "Never mind, father. It's good discipline. White Fang will have to learn many things, and it's just as well that he begins now. He'll adjust himself all right." The carriage drove on, and still the college blocked White Fang's way. He tried to outrun her by leaving the drive and circling across the lawn, but she ran out from inner and smaller circles, and was always there, facing him with her 2 rows of gleaming teeth. Back he circled, across the drive to the other lawn, and again she headed him off. The carriage was bearing the master away. White Fang caught glimpses of it as it disappeared amongst the trees. The situation was desperate. He essayed another circle. She followed, running swiftly, and then suddenly he turned upon her. It was his old fighting trick. Shoulder to shoulder he struck her squarely. Not only was she overthrown, so fast had she been running that she rolled along, now on her back, now on her side, as she struggled to stop, clawing gravel with her feet and crying shrilly her hurt pride and indignation. White Fang did not wait. The way was clear, and that was all he had wanted. She took after him, never ceasing her outcry. It was the straightaway now, and when it came to real running, White Fang could teach her things. She ran frantically, hysterically, straining the utmost, advising the effort she was making with every leap, and all the time White Fang stood smoothly away from her silently, without effort, gliding like a ghost over the ground. As he rounded the house to the porchery, he came upon the carriage. It had stopped, and the master was all lighted. At this moment, still running at top speed, White Fang became suddenly aware of an attack from the side. It was a deerhound rushing upon him. White Fang tried to face it, but he was going too fast, and the hound was too close. It struck him on the side, and such was his forward momentum and the unexpectedness of it, White Fang was hurled to the ground and rolled clear over. He came out of the tangle, a spectacle of malignancy, ears flattened back, lips writhing, nose wrinkled, his teeth clipping together as the fangs barely missed the hound's soft throat. The master was running up, but he was too far away, and it was Collie that saved the hound's life. Before White Fang could spring in and deliver the fatal stroke, and just as he was in the act of springing in, Collie arrived. She had been outmaneuvered and outrun, to say nothing of her having been unceremoniously tumbled in the gravel, and her arrival was like that of a tornado, made up of offending dignity, justifiable wrath, and instinctive hatred for this murderer from the wild. She struck White Fang at the right angle in the midst of his spring, and again he was knocked off his feet and rolled over. The next moment the master arrived, and with one hand held White Fang, while the father called off the dogs. "I say, this is a pretty warm reception for a poor lone wolf from the Arctic," the master said, while White Fang calmed down under his caressing hand. "In all his life he has only been known once to go off his feet, and here he's been rolled twice in 30 seconds. The carriage had driven away, and the other strange gods had appeared from out of the house. Some of these stood respectfully at a distance, but 2 of them, women, perpetrated the hostile act of clutching the master around the neck. White Fang, however, was beginning to tolerate this act. No harm seemed to come of it, while the noises the god made were certainly not threatening. These gods also made overtures to White Fang, but he warned them off with a snarl, and the master did likewise with word of mouth. At such times White Fang leaned in close against the master's legs, and received reassuring pats on the head. The hound under command, "Dick, lie down, sir," had gone up the steps and laid down on the side of the porch, still growling and keeping a sullen watch on the intruder. Collie had been taken in charge by one of the woman gods, who held arms around her neck and petted and caressed her. But Collie was very much perplexed and worried, whining restlessly, outraged by the permitted presence of this wolf, and confident that the gods were making a mistake. All the gods started up the steps to enter the house. White Fang followed close at the master's heels. Dick on the porch growled, and White Fang on the steps bristled and growled back. "Take Cully inside and leave the two of them to fight it out," suggested Scott's father. "After that they'll be friends." "Then White Fang, to show his friendship, will have to be chief mourner at the fuel," laughed the master. The elder Scott looked incredulously, first at White Fang, then at Dick, and finally at his son. "You mean—" Whedon nodded his head. "I mean just that. You'll have a dead Dick inside 1 minute, 2 minutes at the furthest." He turned to White Fang. "Come on, you wolf. It's you'll they'll have to come inside." White Fang walked stiff-legged up the steps and across the porch, with tail rigidly erect, keeping his eyes on Dick to guard against a flank attack, and at the same time prepared for whatever fierce manifestation of the unknown that might pounce out upon him from the interior of the house. But no thing of fear pounced out, and when he gained the inside he scooted carefully around, looking at it and finding it not. Then he lay down with a contented grunt at the master's feet, observing all that went on, ever ready to spring to his feet and fight for life with the terrors he felt must be lurking under the trap roof of the dwelling. End of Section 5, Chapter 2.